Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Small, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Gesshoo, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Dani.
Small, Chapter 10. Tally, I need you to focus. Sarah's voice was scratchy from overuse, and she knew she needed to rest. They both did. But her heart hadn't stopped hammering in what felt like days now. Her nerves wouldn't allow her any respite. Sarah had never experienced such anxiety over performing work, yet here she was, overworking her 5-year-old soulmate because she could think of no other way to alleviate her concerns. They had to get this right. It had to be precise. It had to be perfect. And they had less than 24 hours now until they would attempt the work in earnest. But Sarah, I'm so sleepy, Tally whined, her small voice just as tired as Sarah's. She punctuated her words with an obnoxiously loud, full-bodied yawn, wriggling and stretching atop their bed like a dying worm. I need rest. I know, my love, Sarah croaked. Just a few moments more. I promise. No, Tally grumbled into her pillow. We already practiced. Only once more, Sarah promised, and Tally huffed and kicked her legs. She rolled over to look up at Sarah, and her cheeks were red with frustration. Her big, sleepy eyes welled with tears as she rubbed at them, and Sarah knew she had truly reached her limit. She freed a heavy sigh and smoothed Tally's hair from her forehead. You are right. You need rest. She bent and lay her forehead to Tally's, nuzzled her nose against the girl's temple. Close your eyes now. Tally instantly obeyed, and not a moment later, her taut, frustrated expression began to loosen. Her brow smoothed, and her eyelids relaxed. Her puffy bottom lip dropped open, and then came out the rattle of chainsaws and leaf blowers, the music of precious nightmares. Sarah chuckled, exhausted, and sang a soft seed to quiet the girl. She then went about the business of readying for bed, a matter of minutes only. When she returned, she slid in beside Tally and pulled her close until her warm back was pressed right to Sarah's chest. Even in sleep, Tally responded, her small hands latching onto Sarah's forearms and holding tight. Good night, my little love, Sarah whispered into Tally's hair, knowing she would receive no response. I will see you soon. Please, she added, for only the cavernous space of her own mind. Please, she added, for only the cavernous space of her own mind, hollowed by fear. Her thoughts had been racing for days, since the first utterance of words from Khalidah's discordantly youthful lips. But now, as she lay beside Tally, facing a frightful, potentially glorious unknown, Sarah felt little more than empty. Her nerves were wild, sparking like mad fire under her skin. But her mind? Her mind had been invaded by terrible stillness, as if even her very soul was afraid to move or breathe, if only to keep from stirring away hope. When Tally woke much later in the morning than her usual, Sarah was still at her side. She'd slept little herself and spent most of her nights cycling between restless slumber, soothing away the little frowns and whimpers that found Tally in her sleep, and huffed impatient breaths that left Sarah feeling weak and overexerted. She'd not bother to rise at any point, neither to dress, nor work, nor wander, not even to relieve herself. Instead, she spent the night and morning with her mind occupied by only this one small girl who had owned her soul since a wild Beltane dance on a wild Beltane night, what now felt like ages ago. This one small girl who had given Sarah her heart in as visceral a way as a heart could be given, outside of tearing the organ from her very chest and handing it over, pulpy and dripping. Tally had altered herself entirely, risked her life, sacrificed her body and her time on earth, all for a love they might never fully understand, but that simply existed and bloomed like awesome nature, terrible and wonderful and all-encompassing. Nothing had been the same since the Tarim, since that first sacrifice, that first bodily alteration. And in only a few hours, Tally would be altered once more with no certainty as to what would come of it. They could hope, they could pray, they could do their very best work, but ultimately, there were no guarantees. Such unknowns caused Sarah incredible anguish. Part of her so feared the spectrum of possibilities that she considered doing away with the procedure entirely. Keep Tally as she was, as difficult as it may be. She wasn't as she was meant to be, no, nor as Sarah would have her, but she was alive. She was happy. She smiled and played and seemed perfectly content in her child's body. Would putting her through this again be something done truly for her benefit or for Sarah's? "Hi, Sarah?" Sleepy eyes peeked up at Sarah from little holes in the unruly auburn nest devouring Tally's face and pillow. Tally's voice was scratchy and worn, from rest or work, or more likely both, and the sound made Sarah's heart ache. A little hand shot up to Sarah's face and smacked gently against her cheek. Tally squeezed and kneaded, her fingers poking at Sarah's skin, as Sarah sighed and allowed it. Then Tally pinched her, index and thumb latching onto one corner of Sarah's mouth and pulling it up into a half smile. "So grumpy," she muttered, and Sarah felt an ounce of release in her chest. Precious sort of loosening. She chuckled and raised her hand to encompass Tally's, pulling it away to mold their fingers together. "Not grumpy," she said, "only concerned." "Well, stop it," Tally said, and Sarah freed another laugh. "I'm afraid I don't know how, my love." With a yawn that shook her entire body, Tally twisted and stretched and then crawled up into Sarah's lap, giving little care to how thoroughly she mashed Sarah's organs in the process. She plopped down on Sarah's thighs and shoved her wild hair out of her face with a huff. Then she latched onto Sarah's cheeks once more and cupped them. "Be happy, like Tally." With a pronounced sigh, Sarah forced a smile and said, "I will do my best." "That's all you can do, my Sarah," Tally chirped and leaned in to plant a ridiculously loud kiss to Sarah's lips, then another to her nose, then once more right between Sarah's brows. "Now we need breakfast." Sarah laughed, soft and quiet. "Soon," she said, and gently urged Tally against her chest, smiled into the girl's messy hair as she stretched out along Sarah's torso and curled her arms around her middle. "Let me hold you for a moment first." Tally seemed perfectly content to allow it, snuggling Sarah as fiercely as Sarah did her, and humming a pleased, pitchy sound when Sarah stroked down her back. Her little hands squeezed Sarah's sides, fingers toying with the thin material of her nightgown. "Sarah?" she whispered after a while, her voice sleepy once more, lulled by the warmth and touch. What is it, my love?" "Don't be scared, okay?" Sarah's heart seized, clenching and trembling like a creature fighting to live, to hope. "How do you know I'm scared?" she asked quietly, never ceasing her gentle stroking. Tally was warm and solid against her chest, and Sarah was loath to move her, loath to begin their day, loath to do anything but linger and refuse to stop. Tally shrugged one small shoulder, toyed with Sarah's nightgown again. "Because you're mine." Fuck! This awful stinging. Sarah closed her eyes, hated the moisture pooling behind her lids, but could do nothing to stop it. She freed a slow breath and squeezed Tally until the girl squeaked the tiniest bit, but didn't struggle against her hold. "Tally," she said, and refused to acknowledge the crack in her own voice. "Do you understand what is to happen today? Do you understand this procedure?" Tally pushed to sit up and shoved her hair from her face again so she could meet Sarah's eyes. "I'm going to be big again." "Yes, that is the hope," Sarah said and smoothed a hand over auburn. She palmed one of Tally's puffy cheeks for only a moment, then let her hand fall to her own chest. As soon as it landed, Tally's own little hand curled around it, the tips of her fingers dipping into the spaces between Sarah's. "But any number of things could go awry, and I worry." And she knows. She knows this is ridiculous, attempting this conversation with a 5-year-old. But Tally was still her Tally, her soulmate, and she couldn't not. Not when their quiet conversations in the privacy of their own bedroom had always been Sarah's solace. When she could be weak and vulnerable, or silly and stupid, Tally was her sanctuary, her haven, her church. She was helpless to do anything but bare her soul and confess before the truest, holiest love she had ever known. "Tally, I worry I could lose you," she admitted. "This never should have happened. Any of this. What you have done for me, what you've given, it can never be repaid. And I could never be more grateful than I am. But I'm also terrified of the price of it. Your life is too precious. You are too precious. And I fear what would become of me if I lost you. I fear it so much, I feel sick with it." Tally said nothing for a while, only looked at Sarah with a soft sort of helplessness that burned Sarah's edges like flame-licking paper. She melted and took Tally's cheek in her hand again. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered. "That was too much for you." Small tears dropped from Tally's long lashes and down her cheeks, soaking into Sarah's palm. And it was clear Tally didn't understand the reason for them, nor for the ache that so obviously riddled her. Sarah herself wondered if it was a product of their bonds, an echo inside her from Sarah's own soul, or if it was the result of a child's natural empathy, that ability to sense another's melancholy and make it their own, with or without reason. Perhaps a lovely, heartbreaking combination of the two. "Don't be sad, my Sarah," Tally whimpered and latched onto Sarah's wrist. She squeezed it tightly, then collapsed onto her chest again, hugging her close. "I have you." "And I have you," Sarah said with a sigh and ran a hand over the back of Tally's head. "I have you, Tally, and I am never letting go." Cold. The necropolis's chilled air hit Sarah's overheated skin like a winter breath, forcing a shiver down her spine. Every step toward the building, then down, down, and beyond, had been like a match striking and sparking in her blood. Heat spilled over her nerves, and by the time she reached the lab, Tally bopping along beside her with her hand clutched tightly in Sarah's, she felt flushed and feverish. Sick to her stomach, sick down to her bones, to her marrow. To the lives she lived before Tally, echoes of memories of what had been now tainted with the fear of what may never be. Her insides were chaos, and not even the frozen air could chill her. She would burn and burn until the moment this was done. Sarah, Sarah glanced down at the sudden sharp tug at her hand. Hmm? You're making my chest hurt, Tally said, and rubbed the space above her heart as if to make a point. You're making all our chest hurt. Yarrow's voice floated through Sarah's head. A soft edge adorned it, the gravity of the situation not lost on anyone, even the orneriest of the biddies. Try to take it down a notch, Sarah. With a heavy sigh, Sarah squeezed her girl's hand and smoothed her thumb across the small expanse of it and along her wrist. Forgive me. The only persons in the lab were she and Tally and the biddies, forming a pristine line behind them, and Isadora and Kalida. Sarah had requested that no others be present, not only because she didn't want a crowd distracting Tally from the task at hand, but because she didn't want any more than necessary to see her this way. Twisted and conflicted and fucking terrified. Not Petra, certainly, nor Abigail and Rael, who had been less than enthusiastic about being left out of the affair. Not even Anakostia, who had seen Sarah at her worst more than once. Needless to say, her daughter was also rather displeased. But Sarah didn't want an audience for this. Not this. She didn't want any more nerves feeding into the moment than were strictly necessary, and she certainly didn't want more eyes seeing her in the process, nor the immediate aftermath of the unbiting, were things not to go according to plan. It was bad enough that the ever-vexing Kalida had to be present, but Sarah knew her expertise was needed. They'd not have even known the work required to begin the procedure had it not been for her. Thus, Sarah begrudgingly accepted her presence. The young elder stood off to the side, as stoic and unmoved as ever, though her eyes did soften just a hint when Tally waved happily at her and said, "Hi, Clitta!" "Hello, Tally." "Hi, Doa!" Tally said as she turned her attention to Isadora, yanked her hand from Sarah's, and bounced over to the woman. "Hello," Isadora said with a tempered smile. "You look well rested." She then glanced up at Sarah and shook her head. "You, on the other hand," Sarah grimaced. "Yes, well, Sarah made us practice so much," Tally tattled, using her entire body to exaggerate every syllable. "It was so annoying." The biddies all chuckled when Isadora fixed Sarah with a disapproving stare. "Yes, I expected that would happen," she said, "despite my clear instructions for you both to rest." "The biddies slept," Sarah grumbled. "That is enough to sustain me." "Mm-hmm." Isadora pursed her lips at her, but then turned her attention back to the small girl still bopping at her side. "Now, I suspect our young private requires a lab coat for today's procedure?" Tally's eyes lit up and she bounced even harder. She danced her small behind back and forth as Isadora helped her wriggle into the garment. "Lab coat for Tally!" An adoring smile touched Sarah's lips despite the turmoil still ravaging her insides. Tally's joy was infectious that way, had always been. She settled into her seat in the center of the circle of chairs and forced in a steadying breath. She could hear Savannah in her head, reminding her to have faith, her other biddies humming their agreement as they eased into their own seats. Once everyone was settled, Isadora led Tally to the center and passed her little hand over to Sarah while she went to retrieve a smaller second chair. Every brush of Tally's wee thumb against Sarah's fingers felt amplified, scratchy and soft at once. Every sound in the room, that of Tally's soft breaths and the rustle of Ember's clothes as the biddy readjusted her position, the squeak and creak of the cushioned metal folding chair Isadora pulled from her desk, all of it thumped and grated and pressed at Sarah like angry, incessant hands. Tally, sensing the tumult due to their bonds, stopped her rubbing and instead squeezed Sarah's hand as hard as her child's strength would allow. Sarah closed her eyes at the tight hold and forced in another breath. It rushed through her like a cool breeze, offering a moment of relief so precious she felt her eyes begin to sting with tears. "Come here, my love," she said just as Isadora arrived and settled the chair in place, facing Sarah. Tally happily let Sarah pull her into her lap for a moment. She instantly latched onto Sarah's cheeks and pushed their foreheads together. "All we can do is our best, Sarah," she reminded her quietly, and Sarah took one last deep, focused breath. She nodded, her forehead catching and squeaking over Tally's, then tilted up just enough to press a soft kiss over Tally's puffy little lips. Then one to her cheek, another to her temple. "Follow my lead and hold the notes as long as you can," she whispered just over her ear, "just as we practiced." Tally nodded and ringed her arms around Sarah's neck to embrace her. "I love you, my Sarah." Squeezing her close and tight, Sarah absorbed the feel and scent of her and issued a silent blessing she hoped would take root and bloom. "And I love you, my darling girl." As Tally shimmied off Sarah's lap to climb, instead, into the metal chair opposite her, she shouted, "I love you, my biddies!" "We love you too, Tally," Savannah sweetly replied via the link as the others chuckled and cooed their adoration. "So much," Lisha added at the same time, and the remaining biddies all sighed their agreement. "Well, I'm going to miss having a soulmate," Ophelia said. She'd still be ours," Yarrow said, "even if she's not actually sharing a soulmate bond with us. I claim her." "Agreed." "Everybody loves Tally." Tally let free a delighted giggle and wriggled in her chair until she was comfortable. "I'm ready, Dora." With a snort of a laugh, Isadora turned her attention to Sarah. She lay a hand on Sarah's arm and squeezed, rubbed her thumb comfortingly along her sleeve, only to jerk back with a hiss a moment later when a sharp, quick strike zapped her skin. Sarah gasped as Isadora shook her hand from the sting and quickly sang a seed to soothe it. "Tally!" Sarah snapped. "Oh, no, she didn't," Yarrow said along the link, the shock in her voice dulled by the laugh that followed it. "I like you so much, Dora," Tally said quickly in defense of herself, the same words she uttered to Petra the moment she roughly smacked her little hand to the woman's chest and pushed her away from her soulmate. "But Sarah is mine." "Dear Goddess, Sarah," Ember said, "the girl has clearly become victim to your streaks of jealousy." "And mine," Lisha admitted. "Y'all know I'm envious." "Another reason this unbinding can't wait much longer," Savannah added. "All of our personality traits, Sarah's included, feeding into hers it's just too much. It would be for a witch of any age, but certainly for a child. Remember when that Buttonwood kid found Tally at breakfast the morning after Beltane?" Yarrow's laugh spilled through Sarah's head again. "Oh, God, is that poor boy?" Sarah's glare practically set the mess hall on fire. And she barely even knew Tally at that point. Well, not outside the way she sounded when she was Yarrow, not the time. Sarah sighed and rubbed her temples. "Tally," she said again and shook her head. "You know very well that we do not use work when words will suffice." Tally chewed her lip, her expression riddled with guilt. "But she was touching you." Sarah stared at her, her eyes wide. "Yes, and she is allowed to," she said. "She is my friend, Tally, and she is your superior." "It was barely a zap," Isadora said with an odd huff of a laugh that told Sarah the woman found the tiny attack more humorous than offensive. "And to be fair, she is being influenced by all of you. I'm surprised she has managed as much emotional stability as she has. All is forgiven, Sarah." "No!" It was unacceptable, Sarah said sharply and turned her eyes back to Tally, who was now attempting to fold herself into an invisible knot in her chair. Apologize this instant. Tally's bottom lip quivered dramatically as she forced herself loose again and looked up at Isadora. I'm sorry, Doa. She held one hand out and waited for Isadora to take it. Once she did, Tally lay a tiny kiss on the place she zapped. Mad at Tally? Isadora chuckled. Not at all, Private, she said. But thank you for the apology. Now, are you certain you are ready? Yup, Tally said, clearly glad to be off the topic of her shameful deed. She turned to Sarah and sucked her bottom lip between her teeth again. And you? Sarah glanced up, Isadora's gaze now pinned on her. She sighed and looked back to Tally, who pouted at her and whispered along the link in Sarah's mind. Mad at Tally? No, Tally, Sarah assured. I am not mad at you. I do not approve of what you did, but you did apologize. And now you know not to act in such a way going forward, yes? Yes, my Sarah. Good girl. Sarah turned her eyes back to Isadora and nodded. As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose, she said, and she could see the nerves in Isadora's body. Her air of confidence strong, but thin before Sarah's eyes. She was as rigid in frame as Sarah herself was, and Sarah couldn't fault her for it. What they were about to do had never been done before. A working comprised of 3 lost-to-time Cs graciously given by Kalita, who aided and directed Sarah and Tally in a careful combining of them to produce a work far too advanced for a typical register to maintain, but that proved quite possible with the rare power of pure song. Isadora stepped to the side as Kalita approached the center of the room. She stood just outside the 2 chairs and held one hand up, palm toward Sarah, and the other palm toward Tally. As we discussed, she said calmly, and so it began. The chime of Isadora's tune and fork split the air, and the sound was like ice water spilling down Sarah's spine. Colors bloomed to life before her eyes, such brilliant hues of indigo, pine, and crystal, the latter 2 intertwining, the indigo pure and deep and untouched. Each colorful band undulated in the air, just the slightest dance to the rhythm of each heartbeat and breath attached to the threads like metal stakes wrapped with wire. Dangerous, powerful, and beautiful, able to call and catch lightning, delight and devastate. The green and white threads had thickened since they'd last been revealed, more enmeshed in one another than ever before. And Sarah knew from the sight alone that untangling them would likely be the most tiring work of Isadora's life yet. But if anyone could take on the task and master it, she knew it was this woman. She'd not come across anyone more capable in the art in more than 200 years, not since Isadora's own ancestor had taught Sarah the seed of revival in a barren stretch of desert she'd made bloom with sun, dappled marigolds, miraculously dewy and stretching towards the sky as far as the eye could see. With that reminder, Sarah steeled herself. She summoned her courage, her centuries-long companion, fortified and broken, rebuilt and refortified, and set her gaze on Tally. The small girl's clear excitement to perform the work caused a ripple of anxiety through Sarah's already aching chest. They had to be perfect. Perfectly harmonized, perfectly enduring, and she was terrified Tally's childish thrill might send her seed spiraling out of key. And that wasn't even to think on the influence of the 7 women attached to her, Sarah's own influence included. But then Tally's wild hair was flopping with her small nod, her big brown eyes wide but steady. And just like that, Sarah was certain. Tally could do this. She would do this. They would do this together, and they would be perfect. There was no doubt, no question. There had never in Sarah's mind been anything more perfect than what she and Tally shared together. Something as abundant and precious and infinite as nature. They could do this. She returned her girl's nod, and with a burst of confidence, she opened her mouth and sang. The first seed was the simplest, though by no means simple, merely the most manageable of the three. It spilled free, a warm mezzo-soprano that made Tally bounce happily in her seat. She smiled like the bright, bubbly child she was, opened her mouth, and matched Sarah perfectly. The moment their voices meshed into one solid note, the vibrations of the green and white threads tying 8 souls together began to slow. Khalida gave them both a nod, her eyes fixed sharply on the bonds, and her hand raised as a conductor's guiding an orchestra. When she nodded again, Sarah slowly layered in the second seed, maintaining the first all the while. This seed was the hardest of the three for the breath it required, a deep note, rich and earthy. It trembled in Sarah's chords beautifully, too low for Tally's natural register, which hadn't ceased worrying Sarah since they first began the practice. But their indigo bond gave them abilities they wouldn't otherwise have. And so Tally's sweet, light voice grew deep and heavy as she worked with the difficulty to match Sarah. Her small face scrunched with the effort, and Sarah felt a spike of concern. But Tally held Sarah's gaze and held the note. Her little hands clenched around her knees as she needed something to anchor herself, or else the music might just float her away like water. Maintain it, Khalida said coolly, and watched as the white and green threads slowed even further and began to thin. The thick banding narrowed into smaller strands until they appeared as static-laden hair being freed from a braid. It was stunning to watch, and Sarah had to keep her focus from slipping by closing her eyes. She could feel the strain in her chest as they maintained the 2 heavy seeds. And then, "The third now," Khalida ordered, and Sarah steeled herself again. The third seed wasn't a difficult one on its own, but layering it into an already strained breath was more challenging than she could have ever imagined. And for Tally, it was nigh impossible. All their practice, and the girl still hadn't managed to hold it as long as was required. Sarah pushed back against her fear and called forth that surety she'd only just felt glowing hot in her veins. The certainty of she and Tally, of what they were capable of together. So much more than nature had ever intended, but had blessed all the same. Over and over they've been blessed, goddess, 1,000 times over. As disastrous as some paths had been, they had managed to navigate them, and thus far, they had come through together relatively unscathed. Sarah had lived a long time, hundreds of years. If anyone knew the fortune of survival against impossible odds, it was she. Slowly, she spilled the warbling final note through her vocal, a wispy, airy tone riding the wave of their music, but only just. She opened her eyes again to see Tally's entire body sitting rigidly, all her angles clamped tightly down in her chair. Her knuckles were a sharp white over her knees, and her face was pale and strained, eyes screwed so tightly shut that Sarah knew they had to ache. Still, Tally's small but powerful voice started the airy seed in perfect pitch and matched Sarah's beautifully. "Hold," Khalida commanded, her gaze on the bonds unwavering. Slowly, painfully slowly, the biddy and soul bonds stilled entirely, and the static-like threads softened into fine strands, like long silky hairs floating atop stagnant water. Each tiny strand now entirely visible and individual. It was stunning to behold, an eerie, mystical type of beauty that made Sarah's eyes prick with tears. "Dear goddess," she heard Isadora whisper from nearby. And Sarah couldn't agree more. Her lungs ached and her throat was sore, but she held the seeds, held herself steady, and hoped beyond hope that Tally could and would do the same. She knew the girl was reaching her limit based on the sheer rigidity of her body, but Tally Craven, at any age, was nothing if not determined. Her voice never once wavered. "Hold!" Kalita instructed sharply again as the last few strands unwound themselves and stilled in the air. Then Kalita herself took an expansive breath and freed a note so deep as to sound as if it had been sprouted and grown from the ground itself, from times long past, from history. And in the blink of an eye, all the room, the bonds included, slowed to a near frozen state. And just as intended, Sarah and Tally's layered song slowed to a crawl as well. Quickly, Isadora stepped in, mirroring Kalita's stance on the opposite side, and with poised, diligent fingers, began her careful work. The moment she began, Sarah let her voice croak to its end, her chest heaving, and watched as Tally did the same. Only where Sarah panted, Tally lost consciousness entirely. Her beautiful brown eyes rolled back in her head as a small trickle of blood, not unexpected, dribbled from her nose. Sarah felt moisture at her own and knew she likely mirrored her soulmate. They wouldn't have lasted much longer, even with the power of pure song. She was desperate to pull Tally from her chair, bundle her up in her arms, and hold her throughout the process, but she knew she couldn't. Her own eyes had already begun to flutter, darkness curling at the edges of her consciousness. She imagined the biddies had likely succumbed ages ago, no longer able to feel their alert minds prodding at her own. There was nothing more she could do now. It was up to Kalita and Isadora, the former now holding the beast of a note she sang to keep the work in stasis, and the latter working rapidly to push and pull and rearrange the frozen bonds hanging brightly in the air. Sarah would owe them both tremendously once the work was done. The faster Isadora's fingers grabbed and shifted and flicked, the quicker Sarah's mind sank. Her eyes fluttered to a close, and the last thing lingering in her brain, for the darkness took her entirely, the last precious thought was only this: "I am so very proud of you, my love." And then, like light plunged into a void, she was gone. The dry scratch and ache of her throat woke her. It hurt to swallow. Every breath felt sore and staggered as Sarah slowly blinked open her eyes. Oh, thank the goddess! And Akashya appeared over Sarah, her head like a child's thumb pressed to the sky, blotting out the sun and washing her in blessed shadow. A moment later, her hands gently cupped Sarah's cheeks. "You are never doing anything like this again. Do you hear me? Do you have any idea how long it's been? Hours, Sarah. It's been hours. You cannot even begin to imagine how hard it's been to keep Collar and Bellwether out of the infirmary. I swear they glued themselves to the entrance, just waiting for a chance to infiltrate. We can't seal the doors with a damn bonding powder." Sarah trembled, hot and cold at once. Every word hit her like a partially muted thump to the ear. She heard each one, but barely managed to process. She'd not felt so terribly exhausted in years. Decades. Dal. Her voice croaked and failed her, but Anakostia didn't miss a beat. "Alive," she replied quickly, one thumb quickly swiping through a track of tears on Sarah's cheek that hadn't even realized she cried. "She's in the next bed over, but last I checked, still asleep." Anakostia disappeared only a moment before returning with a small cup of water, as Sarah felt the material beneath her with her hands. She wasn't in her chair, nor was she in Isadora's lab. As she blinked to adjust and slowly took in her surroundings, she realized she wasn't in the necropolis at all anymore. She was in the infirmary. "Is she?" Once more her voice failed her, cracking painfully, and Anakostia shoved the cup at her more insistently. "Drink, mother." Sarah did as she was told, even if the order rankled her. If nothing more, she was desperate for a bit of relief in her throat. The water spilled down like liquid gold, and she found she could only stop once the cup was properly drained. Before she could say a word, however, before she had even properly swallowed her last gulp, Anakostia had refilled the cup and was shoving the bendy straw back in her face in a fashion that Sarah knew would suffer no argument. Sarah rolled her eyes, but took the straw between her lips and drank. Isadora is checking on the biddies, but they all seem fine, Anacostia said as she watched Sarah drink. Kalida exhausted herself to near unconsciousness, but ultimately is fine as well. She's sleeping just a few beds down. Isadora should be sleeping as well, but she's insisting on bouncing between you all until everyone was awake and cleared. Sarah pushed the cup away before Anacostia could insist on filling it again and forced her voice to work. It scratched and strained, but her words came through clearly enough. Did it work, Anacostia? Is she Tally again? Anacostia finished for her, and Sarah nodded, her throat suddenly thick and full with a jagged lump. Her eyes watered as fear settled heavily in her chest. She could feel Tally there, too, so she knew the girl was breathing, knew her heart was beating. But in what body? Anacostia's eyes glistened, too, as she squeezed Sarah's hand and whispered, Do you think you can stand? If she were to be honest, Sarah would have to admit she wasn't sure. If anything, her muscles and nerves screamed the contrary. She felt heavy and achy and not entirely orientated. Dizziness fogged her mind and swirled her gut until she felt sick. But then a voice, soft and supportive, sang through her mind. You can, Sarah. It was Savannah, as gentle and bolstering as ever. Her voice, even in Sarah's head, sounded tired but confident. We will help you. Not a second later, a wave of strength flowed through Sarah's body like an incoming tide. The fog cleared, her stomach calmed, and while she could still feel the stinging weight in her muscles and bones, she now knew without doubt that she could do this. Tightening her grip on Anacostia's hand, she used her daughter's stability to leverage and hoist herself into a sitting position. A moment later, she was on her feet and frantically searching Anacostia's eyes. No, she whispered and felt the fist around hers tighten. Are you ready? Anacostia asked her, and Sarah felt her chest chill anew with apprehension. She couldn't bring herself to speak any louder than an airy murmur lost to any but the woman standing in front of her, holding her steady. Should I be afraid? Anacostia's firm expression leveled, softening to a gentle reassurance that worked miracles on Sarah's nerves as it always has done. Not when you're with me, she promised, and Sarah could do little more than swallow thickly and nod as Anacostia drew open the privacy curtain around Sarah's bed and led her to the next one over, also curtained off. Sarah held her breath as they stood just outside the curtain. Her knees shook, her fingers trembled. Every nerve in her body burned and twitched. The flutter in her gut felt like nausea, fear rapidly renewing itself despite the biddy's support. Thrill unlike any she'd felt in weeks. She was terrified, truly, but just as thoroughly eager. This, she knew, was what hope felt like. Something on the edge of euphoric, tinged with doubt, but daringly wide open. She could float. She could fly. She could fall. Go, Sarah. Savannah's soft voice in her head again pulled Sarah from her paralyzed state, and she took a steadying breath. She stiffened her spine and, with the hand not gripping Anacostia's, she reached for the curtain's edge. As she slowly exhaled, Sarah slid the curtain aside. It screeched and dragged, metal over metal, mere fraction of seconds that felt like hours. And then there she was.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.